6 months after the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy found itself in a desperate struggle for survival in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese Empire, drunk on a string of stunning victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, seemed unstoppable. Their naval forces had swept across thousands of miles of ocean, conquering the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and countless strategic islands with terrifying efficiency. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, now set his sights on a target that would deliver what he believed would be the knockout blow to American naval power: Midway Atoll. What transpired over 4 hellish days in June 1942 would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history, a turning point where the tide of war in the Pacific shifted from Japanese expansion to American resurgence. But this victory came at a horrific cost, drenched in blood, fire, and the screams of dying men sinking beneath the waves. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. Midway Atoll is a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, but it held strategic value far beyond its meager size. For the Japanese, capturing Midway would extend their defensive perimeter and potentially draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers could annihilate their enemies once and for all. Yamamoto understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's in a prolonged war. He needed to force a quick, decisive victory while Japan still held the advantage. For the Americans, Midway represented the last line of defense before Hawaii itself came under direct threat. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew that losing Midway would leave the west coast of the United States vulnerable to Japanese attack. The psychological impact of such a defeat, coming so soon after Pearl Harbor, could potentially force America to seek a negotiated peace in the Pacific. The stakes could not have been higher. This was to be a battle not just for a small atoll, but for the future of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire course of World War II. Unknown to Yamamoto, American cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had achieved one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a team of brilliant codebreakers had partially cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25. Through painstaking analysis of intercepted radio transmissions, they had pieced together the broad outlines of Japanese plans for a massive operation against a target designated AF. The Americans suspected AF was Midway, but they needed confirmation. In a stroke of genius, they ordered Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water purification plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese radio intercepts reported that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was set, and Nimitz now knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. This intelligence advantage would prove decisive, but it also meant that American commanders knew they were sailing their men into what could be a massive trap. The weight of that knowledge, sending thousands of sailors and airmen toward almost certain death, would haunt the American leadership as they prepared for battle. Yamamoto's plan was audaciously complex, involving multiple fleet movements across thousands of miles of ocean. The main striking force under Vice Admiral Nagumo included 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor, and they carried Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had honed their skills in the skies over China and whose expertise in carrier operations was unmatched anywhere in the world. The Japanese force was formidable. 272 aircraft, including the feared Zero fighters that had dominated every air battle since the war began. These pilots were not merely skilled, they were veterans of continuous combat, their survival having honed them into an elite force that American aviators had learned to fear and respect. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster only 3 aircraft carriers: the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea just days before. The Yorktown in particular was held together by what amounted to emergency repairs. Steel plates welded over holes in her flight deck, her fuel tanks patched, and her damaged systems jury-rigged back to functionality. She should have been in dry dock for months. Instead, she sailed to battle with repair crews still working aboard. The American pilots, many of them fresh from training, lacked the combat experience of their Japanese counterparts. What they possessed instead was raw courage and a burning desire for revenge that had been kindling since December 7, 1941. June 4, 1942, dawned clear and calm over the Pacific. At 6:20 a.m., Japanese dive bombers and fighters launched from their carriers, bound for Midway Atoll. The first phase of Yamamoto's plan was to soften up the American defenses before landing troops to capture the island. But American radar operators on Midway had detected the incoming strike. Obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters rose to meet the attackers, their pilots knowing they were flying inferior aircraft against superior enemies. The results were predictably horrific. The Japanese Zeros tore through the American defenders like wolves among sheep. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning aircraft, their pilots either dead in their cockpits or plummeting toward the ocean in flames. On Midway itself, the Japanese bombing was devastating but not decisive. Hangars erupted in massive fireballs, fuel dumps exploded with earth-shaking force, and American personnel dove for any shelter they could find. The ground shook continuously under the impact of bombs, and the air filled with the smoke of burning aviation fuel and the screams of the wounded. Meanwhile, American torpedo bombers from the carriers had found the Japanese fleet. What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. The obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, pressed their attacks against overwhelming odds. The Japanese fighters fell upon them with merciless efficiency. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet was virtually annihilated. Of the 15 aircraft that began the attack, only one survived, piloted by Ensign George Gay, who watched in horror from his life raft as his squadron mates died around him. The waters of the Pacific became a graveyard of twisted metal and burning fuel, dotted with the occasional glimpse of a yellow life jacket marking where another American airman had met his fate. As the morning wore on, it seemed as though the Japanese were grinding toward victory. Their airstrikes had damaged Midway, their fighters had massacred the American torpedo bombers, and their fleet remained unscathed. Admiral Nagumo aboard the flagship Akagi began preparing for a second strike against Midway. But at this crucial moment, the Japanese admiral made a fateful decision. Concerned about the American ships reported in the area, he ordered his aircraft to be rearmed from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes. This process would take time, precious time during which the Japanese carriers would be vulnerable, their flight decks crowded with fuel lines, ordnance, and aircraft. At 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet. What he saw below was a target beyond his wildest dreams. 4 enemy carriers in a neat formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The scene was about to become a vision of hell. McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down from 17,000 feet. The first bomb struck the Akagi near her bridge, the explosion tearing through the ship's vitals. Gasoline vapors ignited in a massive fireball that swept across the flight deck, incinerating everything in its path. Aircraft exploded like firecrackers, their ordnance cooking off in secondary explosions that shook the great ship to her keel. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Yorktown struck the Soryu. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, creating a massive conflagration that turned the ship into a floating furnace. Men trapped below decks faced an unspeakable choice: burn to death or jump into the oil-slicked waters where sharks were already beginning to gather, drawn by the blood and chaos. The Kaga, struck by multiple bombs, became a raging inferno. Her captain, realizing the ship was doomed, ordered abandon ship. Sailors jumped from the blazing decks into the sea, many with their clothes on fire, their screams audible even over the roar of the explosions. Those who survived the jump found themselves swimming in a burning fuel oil. The sea itself seemed to be on fire around them. In the space of just 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were reduced to burning wrecks, the cream of the Japanese naval aviation. Experienced pilots who could never be replaced died in those flames, their expertise and training perishing with them in the twisted wreckage of their aircraft. The surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, launched a desperate counterattack. Her dive bombers found the Yorktown and scored several hits, starting fires and causing severe damage. American damage control parties found the flames with desperate intensity, knowing that their ship and their lives hung in the balance. The scenes below decks on the Yorktown were nightmarish. Sailors worked in smoke-filled compartments where temperatures soared above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation, dragged to safety by shipmates who then returned to continue the fight against the fires. The smell of burning metal, fuel, and flesh permeated the ship. Despite their heroic efforts, the Yorktown was severely damaged and listing. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship, and hundreds of sailors went into the water. Many would never be recovered, their bodies joining the thousands of others that the Pacific would claim during these 4 days of horror. But the Hiryu's victory was short-lived. Late in the afternoon, American dive bombers found the last Japanese carrier. Like her sisters before her, the Hiryu was caught with aircraft on deck being refueled and rearmed. The American bombs turned her into yet another floating pyre. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing his ship was doomed, chose to go down with her. As flames consumed the Hiryu, he and Captain Tomeo Kaku sat on the bridge, sharing a final drink as their ship died beneath them. They were last seen singing the Japanese national anthem as the carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the last remnants of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The statistics of the Battle of Midway tell only part of the story. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 272 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 men. But these numbers cannot convey the true horror of what those men endured in their final moments. In the water around the burning carriers, Japanese sailors faced an agonizing death. Those who had jumped from burning ships often found their clothes ablaze, the fuel oil on the water's surface igniting around them. Many drowned rather than burn, pulling themselves under the waves to escape the flames. Others trapped in compartments below the waterline faced a terrifying choice between drowning and burning as seawater and fire competed to claim them. The Americans, while victorious, paid their own terrible price. The loss of Torpedo Squadron 8 was particularly devastating. Of the 30 men who flew in the squadron, only 1 survived the battle. These were young men, many barely out of their teens, who had volunteered to serve their country and found themselves in the Pacific fighting for their lives against a determined and skilled enemy. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent hours in the water, watching the battle unfold around him. He witnessed Japanese ships exploding, American aircraft being shot down, and men on both sides dying horrible deaths. His testimony provides a unique and harrowing perspective on the battle, describing the oil-slicked waters filled with debris, bodies, and the occasional survivor clinging to wreckage. The Battle of Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air crews was a blow from which Japanese Navy never fully recovered. While Japan could replace the ships, they could never replace the pilots. These men had trained for years and had combat experience that was irreplaceable. Their deaths created a void in Japanese naval aviation that would become increasingly apparent as the war progressed. For the United States, Midway provided the first clear evidence that Japan could be defeated. The victory boosted American morale enormously and validated the strategy of using aircraft carriers as the primary striking force in the Pacific. It also demonstrated the value of intelligence, proving that superior information could overcome numerical disadvantage. The battle established the template for the island hopping campaign that would follow. American forces had learned that they could successfully challenge Japanese naval supremacy, but they had also learned the terrible cost of such victories. The carnage at Midway foreshadowed the brutal battles to come at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Pacific would see many more battles before Japan's surrender in 1945, but none would be more decisive than these 4 days in June 1942, when the fate of nations hung in the balance above a tiny atoll called Midway. Thank you all for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover. This has been Deadliest Disasters.